He was walking through the mall on an ordinary day, only to lock eyes with the one person he thought he'd never see again, his ex-wife. But this billionaire's shock turns to disbelief when he notices two adorable twins by her side. Twins who look exactly like him. What unfolds next is a jaw-dropping mix of love, betrayal, and secrets that money can't hide. The familiar scent of vanilla and jasmine hit Edward Blackman like a physical blow, stopping him mid-stride in the crowded North Point shopping center. His heart hammered against his ribs as he spun around, designer suit wrinkled from the sudden movement, searching the sea of weekend shoppers with desperate eyes. It couldn't be her. Not after 5 years of silence. Not here, in this ordinary place, when he'd searched every corner of the globe. My beautiful family, let's start with a blessing. Dear Lord, I ask you to surround every person watching with peace, healing, and endless love. Amen. You are not just an audience. You are my family, the reason I push through on the hardest days. For those who are new here, welcome to the family. Please subscribe, say hello in the comments, and let's grow closer together. Each story I bring is my sacrifice and devotion. When you walk away early, it feels like my heart is left unheard. Please, stay with me through the journey until the very end. I love you always. Now, let us begin. Edward adjusted his Hermes tie with trembling fingers. The $2.8 billion net worth that usually armored him against the world feeling suddenly worthless. The vanilla scent grew stronger as he pushed through clusters of families, past teenagers clutching bubble tea and elderly couples window shopping. His security team, trailing at their usual discreet distance, quickened their pace to match his sudden urgency. "Sir, is everything?" His head of security began through the earpiece. "Stay back," Edward whispered harshly, his voice cracking on words he hadn't spoken in years. "Just stay back." There, by the children's clothing store, a woman knelt beside a display of tiny sneakers. Her dark hair cascaded in soft waves over her shoulder, longer than he remembered, but unmistakably hers. She wore a simple sundress that hugged curves he'd once traced with reverent hands, her skin still that beautiful deep brown that had made him forget every other woman who'd ever tried to catch his attention. Aaliyah. His ex-wife turned slightly, and Edward caught sight of her profile. The elegant curve of her neck, the concentrated furrow of her brow as she examined a price tag. She was even more beautiful than his tortured memories had preserved, radiating a contentment that made his chest ache with longing and regret. "Mommy, can we get the light-up ones?" A small voice piped up from behind the shoe display. Edward's world tilted on its axis. Two identical boys emerged from behind the rack, and the air rushed from his lungs in a painful whoosh. They couldn't have been more than 4 years old, with skin the perfect blend of his olive complexion and Aaliyah's rich brown, but it was their faces that made his knees nearly buckle. They had his eyes. His exact eyes, that unusual grey-green that had been passed down through 3 generations of Blackman men. His jawline, too, already showing hints of the strong Blackman chin. One boy had Aaliyah's softer features, while the other was nearly a carbon copy of Edward's own childhood photographs. "The light-up shoes are too expensive, baby," Aaliyah said gently, her voice carrying that same musical quality that used to lull him to sleep. "How about these nice blue ones? They'll last longer." The boy, his son pouted in a way that was so distinctly Edward that he had to grip a nearby pillar for support. "But Mama, everyone at school has cool shoes." "Yeah," the second boy chimed in, bouncing on his toes. And Michael said his daddy bought him shoes that cost $100. Aaliyah's expression flickered with something that might have been pain, but she kept her voice steady. Well, those boys are very lucky. But we've talked about this. We buy what we need, not what everyone else has. Edward's hand moved instinctively toward his wallet, where credit cards with no limits waited. He could buy them anything, everything. Light-up shoes, the entire store, a mansion, the best school's money could afford. He could fix this. He could fix everything, if only. "Excuse me, sir?" Edward jerked back to awareness. A mall security guard stood beside him, eyeing him suspiciously. "You've been standing here for 10 minutes staring at that family. Is there a problem?" Heat flooded Edward's face as he realized how he must look. A wealthy man in an expensive suit, fixated on a woman and her children. "No, I thought I recognized someone." The guard's expression softened slightly, but remained alert. "Well, maybe keep moving along. Don't want to make anyone uncomfortable." Edward nodded numbly, forcing his feet to carry him toward the food court. But he couldn't resist one last look over his shoulder. Aaliyah was standing now, holding the hands of both boys as they walked toward the exit. The afternoon sunlight streaming through the skylights caught the gold wedding band on her left hand, and Edward felt his heart shatter all over again. She'd moved on, found someone else. Someone who gave her children, their children, and presumably the love and stability Edward had been too broken to provide. As they disappeared into the crowd, one of the boys turned back, and for a moment, those grey-green eyes met Edward's across the distance. The child tilted his head with curiosity, so purely Blackman that Edward had to sit down heavily on a nearby bench. The questions swirled in his mind as he pulled out his phone with shaking hands. He had resources, connections, ways to find anyone anywhere in the world. But did he have the right? And more terrifyingly, did he have the courage to face what he'd lost, and what finding them again might cost them all? Edward sat in the sterile silence of his penthouse office 40 floors above the city, but his mind remained trapped in that mall corridor, replaying every second of those stolen moments. The floor-to-ceiling windows that usually made him feel like a king surveying his empire now felt like prison bars, separating him from the life he'd glimpsed and lost again in the span of 10 minutes. His fingers traced the rim of his untouched whiskey glass, the amber liquid catching the late afternoon sun. On his mahogany desk, beneath quarterly reports worth hundreds of millions, lay a single photograph, the only one he'd kept from their marriage. Aaliyah laughed in the image, her head thrown back in pure joy as Edward spun her around in their garden. They'd been so young then, so certain that love could conquer the darkness that seemed to follow the Blackman name like a curse. "You always said you wanted children," he whispered to the photograph, his voice echoing in the empty office. "I was the one who said we needed to wait. Wait until the company was more stable. Wait until I'd proven I wasn't like my father. Wait until I deserved you." But waiting had cost them everything. The intercom buzzed, interrupting his spiral into memory. "Mr. Blackman? Mrs. Walter is here for your 6 o'clock. Edward straightened, slipping effortlessly back into his corporate armor. "Send her in." Dr. Sarah Walter entered with the quiet confidence that had made her his most trusted advisor and the closest thing he had to a friend. As his head of corporate development, she'd seen him through hostile takeovers, international scandals, and the devastating months after his divorce when he'd nearly drunk himself out of business. "You look like hell," she said without preamble, settling into the leather chair across from his desk. Her dark eyes, sharp behind designer glasses, studied him with clinical precision. What happened? Edward had built an empire on his ability to lie convincingly, but Sarah had always seen through his masks. I saw her today. Sarah's expression didn't change, but her posture sharpened. She was one of the few people who knew the real reason behind his divorce, the secret shame that had driven him to push away the only woman he'd ever loved. Aaliyah? At North Point Mall, of all places. Edward's laugh held no humor. She has twins, Sarah. Boys. They're about 4 or 5, and they look exactly like me. The silence stretched between them, heavy with implications. Sarah leaned forward, her voice gentle but probing. Are you certain they're yours? I have the same eyes my grandfather had, and his grandfather before him. It's unmistakable. Edward stood and walked to the window, pressing his palm against the cool glass. She was looking at shoes for them, counting every dollar. My children, Sarah, and she can't afford light-up sneakers. Edward. Sarah's voice carried a warning he'd heard before, during his darkest period. You can't just assume. She left because I couldn't give her what she needed, Edward interrupted, his breath fogging the window. She wanted a family, wanted me to heal from my father's abuse, wanted me to trust her enough to be vulnerable. Instead, I worked 18-hour days and drank myself to sleep because facing my demons felt impossible. Sarah moved to stand beside him, her reflection joining his in the glass. You've changed since then. The therapy, the sobriety, the way you've restructured your entire approach to business and relationships. You're not the same man who pushed her away. But am I the man who deserves a second chance? Edward turned to face her, and Sarah saw something in his expression she'd never witnessed before. Hope warring with terror. What if I try to reconnect and destroy what stability she's built? What if I'm still too broken? What if you're not? Sarah countered. What if those boys need their father? And what if Aaliyah never stopped loving the man you've become? Edward's phone buzzed with a text from his private investigator, a man he kept on retainer for corporate espionage, but who could find anyone within hours. His finger hovered over the contact, every instinct screaming at him to gather information, to approach this like a business deal he could control and manipulate. But Aaliyah had never been a deal. She'd been his salvation, and he'd been too afraid of drowning her in his darkness to hold on. There's something else, Edward said quietly. She was wearing a wedding ring. Sarah's eyebrows rose. So she's remarried, which means I'm not just risking my own heart. There's another man involved, someone who's been a father to my sons. Edward's voice cracked on the last word. Someone who was there for their first steps, their first words, every milestone I missed because I was too much of a coward to fight for my marriage. The weight of 5 years of regret settled on his shoulders like a physical burden. Edward had conquered markets, destroyed competitors, and built a financial empire that spanned continents. But he'd failed at the only thing that had ever truly mattered. I need to know more before I make any decisions, he said finally, reaching for his phone. I need to understand what her life looks like now, who this man is, whether my presence would help or hurt those boys. Sarah watched him with concern. And if you find out she's happy? If interfering would only cause pain? Edward stared at the photograph on his desk, at Aaliyah's radiant smile and his own younger, more hopeful face. Then I'll walk away. Again. But this time, I'll make sure those boys have everything they need, even if they never know it came from me. Have you ever had to choose between your own happiness and someone else's well-being? What would you do if you discovered you had children you never knew existed? As the sun set over the city, Edward made the call that would either reunite his family or confirm that some chances, once lost, could never be reclaimed. The silence on the phone stretched until Edward thought his heart might stop beating entirely. Then Aaliyah's voice came through, sharp and controlled in the way that used to terrify his business rivals. "How did you get this number, Edward?" "That's not important right now," he said, pacing the length of his office like a caged animal. "Listen to me carefully. There's a man named Benjamin Sullivan who's trying to destroy me, and he's using you and the boys as leverage. You need to pack up and leave. Tonight." A bitter laugh echoed through the speaker. "Oh, this is rich. 5 years of absolute silence. And now you call with some dramatic story about danger? What kind of game are you playing?" "This isn't a game." Edward's voice cracked with desperation. "Aaliyah, he has your address. He has pictures of the boys. He's threatening to expose everything to the media Unless you what?" Her voice had gone dangerously quiet. "What exactly would he be exposing, Edward? The fact that you walked out on our marriage? The fact that I was pregnant when you filed for divorce?" The words hit Edward like physical blows. "You were pregnant when Oh God, Aaliyah, I didn't know. I swear I didn't know." "Of course you didn't know," she said, and Edward could hear tears beneath her anger. "You were too busy drowning yourself in work and whiskey to notice that your wife was trying to tell you she was carrying your children." Edward's knees gave out, and he collapsed into his chair. The timeline clicked into place with horrifying clarity. Her attempts to have serious conversations that he'd brushed off, the doctor's appointments she'd mentioned that he'd been too distracted to attend, the way she'd looked at him during those final weeks with something that might have been desperate hope. "I tried to tell you," Aaliyah continued, her voice breaking. "For weeks I tried. But you were already gone, Edward. Mentally, emotionally, you'd checked out of our marriage completely." "I was trying to protect you," Edward whispered. "My father's demons, the depression, the drinking. I thought if I could fix myself first, I could come back and be the husband you deserved." "So you made that decision for both of us? You decided I was too weak to handle your struggles?" The hurt in her voice was raw, unfiltered. "I stood by you through panic attacks and nightmares. I held you through flashbacks and held your hand through therapy sessions. But when it came to the real work of healing, you shut me out completely." Edward pressed his palm against his forehead, the weight of his failures crushing down on him. "I know I hurt you. I know I was a coward. But right now, none of that matters. What matters is that you and the boys are safe." "The boys," Aaliyah repeated, and Edward heard movement in the background, footsteps, a door closing. "You saw them, didn't you? At the mall?" "Yes." The admission felt like tearing out his own heart. "They're beautiful, Aaliyah. They look just like their father, I know," she said softly. "Do you have any idea what it was like looking at their faces every day and seeing you? Watching them develop your mannerisms, your expressions, your stubborn streak? Explaining to them why they don't have a daddy when every other kid in their class does." Edward's vision blurred as tears he'd held back for 5 years finally broke free. "What did you tell them?" "The truth. That their daddy had to go away because he was sick, and that sometimes even grown-ups can't fix everything." Her voice was barely a whisper now. "They ask about you sometimes. Whether you ever think about them. Whether you'd like them if you met them." The pain in Edward's chest was so acute he could barely breathe. "I think about them every day. I've thought about you every day since I walked out that door." "Then why didn't you?" Aaliyah's voice broke off abruptly. Wait. Someone's outside. There's a car across the street that wasn't there before. Edward's blood turned to ice. Get away from the windows. Now. Edward, you're scaring me. Good. You should be scared. Edward was already signaling to his security team through the glass walls of his office. Listen to me very carefully. Pack only what you absolutely need. I'm sending my security team to get you. They'll be there in 15 minutes. I'm not going anywhere with your people. Aaliyah's voice rose with panic. I don't even know if I believe this story about. Her words cut off with a sharp gasp. Edward's heart stopped. Aaliyah? What's happening? There's someone at the door, she whispered. They're knocking, but it's wrong somehow. Too aggressive. Edward was already running toward the elevator, phone pressed to his ear. Do not open that door. Get the boys and go out the back. My team is en route, but don't wait for them if you feel unsafe. The boys are at my sister's for the night, Aaliyah said, and Edward nearly collapsed with relief. But Edward, whoever's at the door, they're not going away. The sound of splintering wood came through the phone, followed by Aaliyah's scream. Aaliyah! Edward roared into the phone as he burst into the parking garage. Aaliyah! The line went dead. Edward's hands shook as he called his head of security while running toward his car. Emergency code read, Aaliyah Williams, 2247, Oak Street, Riverside. Someone's broken into her apartment. Get every available man there now. He was breaking every speed limit when his phone rang. Sarah's name flashed on the screen. Edward, where are you? Driving to Aaliyah. Someone broke into her apartment. Edward's voice was deadly calm, the kind of calm that usually preceded corporate warfare. If anything happens to her, I'm going to destroy Benjamin Sullivan so completely that his great-grandchildren will feel it. The police are already en route, Sarah said. Your security team is 2 minutes out. But Edward, you need to know, this might be exactly what Sullivan wants. If you show up there, if you're photographed at the scene. I don't care about the photographs, Edward snarled. I don't care about the company, the money, the reputation. None of it means anything if she's hurt. As he screeched around the corner onto Oak Street, Edward saw police cars and his own security vehicles converging on a small apartment complex. His heart hammered against his ribs as he spotted a familiar figure on the building's front steps, wrapped in a blanket and speaking to police officers. Aaliyah was alive. Shaken, but alive. Edward parked and approached slowly, unsure of his reception, but unable to stay away. When Aaliyah looked up and saw him, her expression cycled through shock, anger, and something that might have been relief. Ma'am, one of the officers was saying, the intruders appear to have been looking for something specific. They went through your personal papers, your computer. Any idea what they might have been after? Aaliyah's eyes met Edward's across the distance, and in that moment, he saw her understanding crystallize. This wasn't random. This was exactly what he'd warned her about. Yes, she said quietly, never breaking eye contact with Edward. I think I know exactly what they were looking for. As police lights painted the night in red and blue, Edward realized that protecting his family might cost him everything he'd spent 5 years building. And for the first time since his divorce, that felt like exactly the right trade to make. 2 hours later, Aaliyah sat in the passenger seat of Edward's Bentley, her hands wrapped around a cup of coffee that had long gone cold. The police had finished their investigation. Edward's security team had swept her apartment for surveillance devices, and now they were parked outside her sister's house where the twins slept, oblivious to the chaos surrounding their lives. "They took my laptop and went through all my papers," Aaliyah said, breaking the heavy silence. "But they left my jewelry, my TV, even the cash I keep in the Kit Walter jar. They weren't burglars." Edward's knuckles were white against the steering wheel. "They were looking for documentation. Birth certificates, medical records, anything that could prove the boys are mine." "Why?" Aaliyah turned to face him, and Edward was struck by how exhausted she looked. Dark circles shadowed her eyes, and her usually perfect posture had collapsed inward. "What could Benjamin Sullivan possibly gain from exposing us?" Edward took a shaky breath. This was the moment he'd been dreading. The moment he had to reveal the depth of his failures as both a husband and a father. "He's trying to force me out of my own company. The board sees me as unstable because of how badly I fell apart after our divorce." "You fell apart?" There was something sharp in Aaliyah's voice. "You fell apart?" "Edward, I was the one left to pick up the pieces while you disappeared into your corporate fortress." "I know that." Edward's voice was barely a whisper. "But what you don't know is how close I came to not making it through those first few months. The drinking got worse. Much worse. I was hospitalized twice for alcohol poisoning." Aaliyah's sharp intake of breath cut through the darkness of the car. "Edward, Sarah found me one morning, unconscious in my office. I'd been there for 3 days, and I honestly can't remember most of it." Edward's confession poured out like poison finally being drained from a wound. "That's when she forced me into rehabilitation. Real rehabilitation, not just the therapy sessions I'd been half-heartedly attending." "Why are you telling me this?" Aaliyah's voice was thick with unshed tears. "Because Sullivan knows all of it. The hospitalizations, the rehab, the fact that I was declared temporarily unfit to run the company while I got sober." Edward finally turned to look at her, and the pain in his grey-green eyes was devastating. "And now he knows that the reason I fell apart wasn't just business stress or my father's abuse. It was because I'd lost you and didn't even know I'd lost my children too." The silence that followed felt like standing at the edge of a cliff. Aaliyah stared at him, her expression cycling through emotions too complex to name. "You almost died," she said finally. "While I was struggling through pregnancy alone, working extra shifts to save money, crying myself to sleep every night, you were dying." "I'm not telling you this for sympathy," Edward said quickly. "I'm telling you because Sullivan is going to use it. He's going to paint me as an unstable drunk who abandoned his pregnant wife, and has now become obsessed with the children he never knew existed. And the worst part is, he's not entirely wrong." Aaliyah was quiet for so long that Edward thought she might ask him to leave. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely audible. "Do you want to know the real reason I never told you about the pregnancy before filing for divorce?" Edward's heart clenched. "If you want to tell me." "Because I was terrified that you'd stay out of obligation instead of love." The words came out in a rush, as if she'd been holding them back for years. "I knew you were spiraling. I knew you were drinking more and sleeping less. But I also knew that if I told you I was pregnant, you'd force yourself to stay and slowly destroy yourself trying to be someone you weren't ready to be." Edward felt like he'd been struck by lightning. "So you chose to raise them alone rather than trap me in a marriage I couldn't handle?" "I chose to give you the chance to heal," Aaliyah corrected, tears finally spilling down her cheeks. I hoped, that maybe someday you'd get better and come looking for us. That you'd be ready to be the father they deserved instead of the broken man you were then." The revelation shattered something fundamental inside Edward's chest. All these years, he'd believed she'd left because he wasn't good enough, because he was too damaged to love. But she'd left to save him from himself. "Aaliyah," he breathed, reaching toward her before stopping himself. "I'm so sorry. For all of it. For not fighting harder for our marriage, for not getting help sooner, for letting you carry that burden alone." "Are you better now?" she asked, wiping her tears with the back of her hand. "Really better, not just functioning better?" Edward considered lying, considered giving her the easy answer she might want to hear. Instead, he chose the truth that had taken him 5 years to understand. "I'm sober. I've been in therapy consistently since the hospitalization. I've learned to recognize my triggers and deal with them in healthy ways." He paused, gathering courage for the hardest admission. "But am I the man you fell in love with? I don't know. I'm different now. More careful, maybe more guarded in some ways. The reckless passion that made you love me, I had to learn to control it because it was destroying me." Aaliyah studied his face in the dim light from the street lamps. "Show me your hands." "What?" "Your hands. Show me." Edward extended his hands, palms up, not understanding. Aaliyah took them in hers, her touch sending electricity through his entire body. She examined his fingers, his palms, then gently turned his hands over. "No tremors," she said quietly. "Your nails aren't bitten. You're not picking at your cuticles." She looked up at him, and Edward saw something in her expression he hadn't dared hope for. "When you were drinking, your hands always shook slightly, even when you thought I didn't notice." Edward's throat constricted. She'd been watching him more carefully than he'd ever realized. "The boys ask about you," Aaliyah said suddenly. "Not just whether you'd like them, but whether you're okay, whether you're happy. Benjamin is 5 minutes older, and he's protective like you were. He worries that his daddy might be sad somewhere." "Benjamin," Edward repeated, his voice breaking on his son's name. "And Ethan? He's quieter, more thoughtful. He draws pictures sometimes and tells me they're for his daddy, even though he's never met you." Aaliyah's voice grew stronger, more determined. "They deserve to know their father, Edward. The real you, not the broken man you were 5 years ago." Edward felt hope blooming in his chest like a physical warmth. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that maybe Sullivan threatening us was exactly what we needed. Maybe it forced us to have the conversation we should have had years ago." Aaliyah squeezed his hands. "But I need to know that you're ready for this. Really ready. Because if you walk into their lives now, you can't disappear again. They couldn't survive that, and neither could I." Edward brought her hands to his lips, pressing gentle kisses to her knuckles. "I've been ready for this conversation for 5 years. I was just too afraid you'd never want to have it. What would you do if you discovered that someone you loved had made an impossible sacrifice to protect you? How do you prove you've truly changed when your past mistakes have caused so much pain?" As they sat in the darkness outside her sister's house, Edward realized that winning back his family wouldn't require grand gestures or corporate maneuvering. It would require something far more difficult: complete vulnerability and the courage to trust that love could indeed conquer the darkness that had once consumed him. The next morning brought devastation in the form of newspaper headlines and viral social media posts. Edward stared at his phone screen in his hotel room, watching his world crumble in real time. Benjamin Sullivan hadn't waited the full 48 hours. He'd released everything at dawn. Billionaire's secret shame, Edward Blackman's hidden children, and abandoned pregnant wife. The photos were everywhere. Aaliyah at the mall with the twins, Edward watching from a distance, surveillance shots of their apartment building. But worse than the invasion of privacy were the lies woven between fragments of truth. The articles painted him as a man who'd abandoned his pregnant wife for his corporate empire, then became obsessed with stalking his own children. His phone buzzed with a call from Sarah. "Edward, it's worse than we thought. The board moved faster than expected. They're calling an emergency meeting in 2 hours to vote on your removal." "Let them," Edward said, surprising himself with his calm. "I'm more worried about Aaliyah and the boys." "You should be worried about yourself too," Sarah's voice was grim. "Sullivan's people are already outside her sister's house. The twins' school has been contacted by reporters. This isn't just corporate warfare anymore. It's character assassination on a national scale." Edward's calm shattered. He could handle his own reputation being destroyed, but his children were now fair game for tabloid vultures. "Where are they now?" "Still at the sister's house, but it's not secure. Edward, you need to get them somewhere safe, and then you need to fight Sullivan properly. Through legal channels, through—" "No." Edward's voice was steel. "I'm done fighting dirty. I'm done with corporate games. If the board wants me out, they can have the company. All I care about is protecting my family." He ended the call and immediately dialed Aaliyah. She answered on the first ring. "Have you seen it?" Her voice was hollow, defeated in a way that broke his heart. "All of it. I'm so sorry, Aaliyah. This is exactly what I was trying to prevent." "The reporters found us," she said, and Edward could hear the exhaustion and fear. "They're camping outside Michelle's house. The boys don't understand why strange people are taking pictures and asking questions about their daddy." Edward's heart clenched. "Are they okay?" "They're scared and confused. Benjamin asked me if his daddy is a bad man because the people outside were saying bad things." Aaliyah's voice cracked. "How do I explain this to them, Edward? How do I tell them that their father is famous and rich, but we've been struggling because he didn't know they existed?" "Don't," Edward said firmly. "Don't explain anything yet. Just pack whatever you need and meet me. I'm going to get you somewhere safe, away from all of this." There was a long pause before Aaliyah spoke again. "Edward, I've been thinking about what you said last night, about proving you've changed. But seeing all this coverage, seeing how the media is twisting everything." Her voice grew small. "Maybe some things are too broken to fix." The words hit Edward like physical blows. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that maybe us trying to reconnect was a mistake. Maybe the boys and I are better off staying in our quiet life, away from your world of corporate warfare and public scrutiny." Aaliyah's voice grew stronger, but Edward could hear the pain beneath her resolve. They were happy before this happened. They had friends, a normal life. Now they're going to grow up as the billionaire's secret children, with every relationship scrutinized and every mistake magnified. "Aaliyah, please don't do this," Edward begged, his voice breaking. "Don't let Sullivan win. Don't let him destroy what we found again." "What did we find, Edward?" Aaliyah asked quietly. "One honest conversation. That doesn't erase 5 years of separation. It doesn't change the fact that your world is toxic for children." Edward's phone beeped with another call. Sarah again, probably with more bad news about the board meeting. He ignored it. "My world doesn't have to be toxic. I can change that. Can you? Can you really walk away from everything you've built? Because that's what it would take, Edward. A complete life change. And I can't ask that of you." The hotel room felt like it was closing in around Edward. Through the window, He could see news vans gathering in the parking lot below. They'd found him too. Soon there would be no safe spaces left for any of them. "You're not asking," Edward said softly. "I'm offering. I'll walk away from all of it. The company, the money, the public life. We'll disappear if we have to. I'll be whatever you need me to be." "That's exactly what I'm afraid of," Aaliyah whispered. "I don't want you to be what I need you to be. I want you to be who you are. And who you are is Edward Blackman, billionaire CEO. Take that away, and will you still be the man I fell in love with? Or will you resent us for making you give up everything you worked for?" The question hung in the air like a death sentence. Edward realized with crystalline clarity that Aaliyah was doing exactly what she'd done 5 years ago, making the impossible choice to protect him from a situation she believed would destroy him. "You're leaving me again," he said, the words barely audible. "I'm setting you free again," she corrected. "The boys and I will disappear. Change our names, move somewhere quiet. You can fight Sullivan and win back your company without worrying about us being used as weapons against you." Edward's vision blurred as tears he'd refused to shed finally broke free. "I don't want to be free. I want to be their father. I want to be your—" "Goodbye, Edward," Aaliyah whispered, and the line went dead. Edward stared at his phone in numb disbelief. In the space of 24 hours, he'd found his family and lost them all over again. This time, though, it felt final in a way their divorce never had. This time, Aaliyah wasn't leaving because he was too broken to love. She was leaving because loving him had become too dangerous for their children. His phone rang again. Sarah, relentless in her loyalty. "The board meeting is starting," she said without preamble. "They've already decided, Edward. Sullivan has the votes. But if you come in now, if you fight back with everything we have—" "No," Edward said, his voice hollow. "Let him have it. Let him have all of it. Edward, you can't be serious. This is your life's work." Edward looked around the luxury hotel suite that suddenly felt like a gilded prison. "My life's work was supposed to be building something to leave to my children. Now I've lost them again because of it. What's the point of an empire with no one to inherit it? So what are you going to do?" Edward walked to the window and looked down at the gathering media storm. Reporters were setting up cameras, preparing to broadcast his downfall to the world. In a few hours, Benjamin Sullivan would be the new CEO of Blackman Industries, and Edward would be left with nothing but his regrets. "I'm going to disappear too," Edward said quietly. "Maybe Aaliyah is right. Maybe some things are too broken to fix." As Edward watched the vultures gather below, he realized that losing his family twice might be a pain too great for even his newfound sobriety to survive. 3 days after losing everything, Edward sat in a diner outside of Phoenix, Arizona, wearing jeans and a plain t-shirt for the first time in years. His Bentley was gone, sold to a collector who hadn't asked questions. His penthouse was empty, his corporate empire now under Benjamin Sullivan's control. The man who had once commanded boardrooms now nursed his third cup of coffee while rain pelted the windows of the small roadside restaurant. His phone, a simple model he'd bought with cash, buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "The boys asked me today why God made their daddy too sad to come home. I told them sometimes grown-ups get lost, even when they have maps." Edward's hands trembled as he read the message again. Somehow, despite everything, Aaliyah was still thinking about him, still seeing him as a father rather than the monster the media had painted. "You look like a man who's lost everything," a voice said beside him. Edward looked up to find an elderly black woman sliding into the booth across from him. She was perhaps 70, with silver hair pulled back in an elegant bun and eyes that seemed to see straight through to his soul. "Excuse me? I said you look like a man who's lost everything," she repeated, signaling to the waitress for coffee. "I should know. I've seen that look in the mirror plenty of times." Edward studied her face. "Have we met?" "Not directly. But I know who you are, Mr. Blackman. Or should I say, former Mr. Blackman." She extended a weathered hand. "I'm Ruth Williams, Aaliyah's grandmother." Edward's world tilted. "How did you find me?" "Honey, when you've lived as long as I have, you learn to find people who need finding." Ruth's eyes twinkled with mischief and wisdom. "Besides, my granddaughter might be stubborn as a mule, but she's got a soft heart. She's been tracking you through your credit cards, making sure you were okay." "She's been, what?" Edward's coffee cup clattered against the saucer. "Oh, she didn't tell you she hired that private investigator? Same one you used to find her, I believe. Turnabout's fair play." Ruth chuckled. "That girl has been worried sick about you, even while she's trying to protect those babies from the circus you two created." Edward leaned back against the vinyl seat, overwhelmed. "She told me to stay away. She said my world was too toxic for the boys." "And you believed her?" Ruth's eyebrows rose. "Son, that girl has loved you for 7 years straight, through marriage, divorce, pregnancy, single motherhood, and now this media nightmare. You think she's really ready to give up on you now? Then why?" "Because she's scared." Ruth's voice softened. "She's terrified that you'll choose your old life over her and those babies. Again, she'd rather break her own heart than watch you break theirs." Edward stared out the rain-streaked window. "I already chose. I gave up everything, the company, the money, the lifestyle. All of it." "No, you didn't," Ruth said gently. "You ran away from everything. There's a difference." The words hit Edward like a slap. "What do you mean?" "Giving up your company to protect your family? That's noble. Running away to a diner in Arizona because the fight got hard? That's quitting." Ruth leaned forward, her voice gaining intensity. "My granddaughter doesn't need you to sacrifice everything for her, Edward. She needs you to fight for her." "I did fight," Edward protested weakly. "I tried to protect them from Sullivan." "You protected them from Sullivan by removing yourself from the equation," Ruth corrected. "But who's protecting them from the media? Who's controlling the narrative? Who's making sure those babies understand that their daddy isn't the monster the newspapers say he is?" Edward's chest tightened. "I can't go back. Sullivan has everything now. The board, the company, the power." "Sullivan has your company," Ruth interrupted. "He doesn't have your story. He doesn't have the truth. And he sure as hell doesn't have your family's love." She pulled out her own phone and showed Edward a video. His heart stopped as he recognized the setting. It was Aaliyah's sister's living room. Benjamin and Ethan sat on the couch, both wearing identical expressions of solemn concentration. "Tell Daddy about your day." Aaliyah's voice came from behind the camera. Benjamin, the older twin by 5 minutes, looked directly into the lens with gray-green eyes exactly like Edward's. "Daddy, I learned about superheroes in school today. Miss Johnson said real superheroes don't always wear capes. They just do the right thing even when it's really, really hard." Ethan nodded seriously. "And Mama said you're trying to be a superhero by keeping the bad people away from us. But we don't need a superhero, Daddy. We just need you." The video ended, and Edward buried his face in his hands as 5 years of suppressed emotion crashed over him like a tidal wave. These children, his sons, didn't care about his corporate empire or his public reputation. They just wanted their father. How? Edward whispered through his tears. How do I fix this? I've lost everything I built, and Sullivan has made sure I'll never get it back. Ruth reached across the table and covered his hands with hers. Baby boy, you've been thinking about this all wrong. You don't need to get your old life back. You need to build a new one. A better one. With what? I have no company, no platform, no way to fight back against the lies. You have something more powerful than any corporation, Ruth said with a smile. You have the truth, and you have a family worth fighting for. She pulled out a business card and slid it across the table. Edward looked down to see the logo for a major television network. What's this? My neighbor's daughter is a producer at Channel 7. She's been following your story, and she thinks the real narrative, the one about a man who lost his way and found it again through love, is a lot more compelling than Sullivan's version. Edward stared at the card. A television interview? A chance to tell your side. To show the world who you really are, not who Sullivan says you are. To let your sons see their father standing up and fighting for his family instead of running away. Edward's mind raced. A public interview meant exposing himself completely, admitting to his failures on national television, opening himself up to even more scrutiny. But it also meant the chance to reclaim his story, to show Benjamin and Ethan that their father was indeed willing to be a superhero. Not by wearing a cape, but by doing the right thing when it was really, really hard. If I do this, Edward said slowly, there's no going back. No more hiding, no more running. Honey, Ruth said with a grin that reminded him startlingly of Aaliyah, the only direction worth going is forward. What would you do if you had one chance to tell the world your truth? How far would you go to prove to the people you love that you've truly changed? For the first time in days, Edward felt hope stirring in his chest. Not the desperate hope of a man trying to reclaim his empire, but the quiet determination of a father ready to fight for his children's future. 1 week later, Edward sat in the bright lights of Channel 7's studio, facing veteran journalist Maria Santos across a simple coffee table. For the first time in months, he felt completely calm. Not the artificial calm of corporate negotiations, but the deep peace that came from finally knowing exactly who he was and what he was fighting for. Mr. Blackman, Maria began, you've been called everything from an abandoned father to a corporate predator in the past 2 weeks. Tonight, you're here to set the record straight. Let's start with the most serious allegation, that you abandoned your pregnant wife. Edward looked directly into the camera, knowing that somewhere Aaliyah and his sons might be watching. Maria, I didn't abandon my pregnant wife. I was so consumed by my own demons, depression, anxiety, the trauma from my father's abuse, that I missed every sign that she was trying to tell me we were expecting children. When our marriage fell apart, I was so ashamed of my failures as a husband that I convinced myself she was better off without me. But you never tried to contact her after the divorce? I was in rehabilitation for alcohol dependency, Edward said, his voice steady despite the weight of the admission. Twice. I was hospitalized for alcohol poisoning because I couldn't handle losing her. I spent 2 years in intensive therapy learning how to be a functional human being before I was stable enough to even think about reaching out. Maria leaned forward. And when you did get stable? Edward's composure cracked slightly. By then, I was convinced it was too late. I thought she'd moved on, found someone better. I thought I'd done too much damage to ever deserve forgiveness. He paused, gathering his courage for the most important words he'd ever spoken. I was wrong. I should have fought for my family instead of making the decision for both of us that we were better apart. Your ex-wife has remained largely silent during this media storm. What would you say to her now, if she's watching? Edward's eyes filled with tears, but his voice remained strong. Aaliyah, I know you're trying to protect Benjamin and Ethan from the chaos of my world. But our boys don't need protection from me. They need their father. And I need them more than I've ever needed anything in my life. He looked directly into the camera. I'm not asking you to take me back. I'm not asking you to forgive 5 years of absence. I'm asking you to let me prove that I'm finally the man our sons deserve to call Daddy. The interview continued for another hour, with Edward revealing everything. His father's abuse, his struggles with mental health, the real reason behind his corporate success, and his complete willingness to walk away from wealth and power for his family. When Maria asked about Benjamin Sullivan's hostile takeover, Edward's response surprised everyone. Benjamin Sullivan did me the greatest favor of my life, Edward said with genuine gratitude. He forced me to choose between my corporate empire and my family. For the first time, I made the right choice. So you have no plans to fight for control of Blackman Industries? Edward smiled, the first genuine smile he'd worn in years. I'm fighting for something much more valuable than a company, Maria. I'm fighting for the chance to be Benjamin and Ethan's father. The interview ended, but Edward remained seated as the studio lights dimmed around him. His phone had been buzzing constantly with calls from reporters, board members, and business rivals. He ignored them all except for one number he didn't recognize. Hello, he answered. Daddy. Edward's heart stopped. The small voice on the other end was cautious, but unmistakably hopeful. Benjamin. Edward whispered. We watched you on TV, his son said matter-of-factly. Mama cried, but she said they were happy tears. Ethan wants to talk to you too. There was shuffling on the line, then another small voice. Daddy, are you really sorry for being gone so long? Edward closed his eyes, tears streaming down his face. I'm so sorry, Ethan. I'm sorry for missing your whole lives so far. But if Mama says it's okay, I'd like to try to make up for it. Can you come see us? Benjamin's voice was back on the line. Mama says we might be able to meet you if you promise not to go away again. I promise, Edward said, his voice breaking with joy and relief. I will never, ever go away again. We made you pictures, Ethan chimed in. Hundreds of them. And we learned how to ride bikes. And we can both tie our shoes now. Edward laughed through his tears. I can't wait to see everything. I can't wait to meet you both properly. The line went quiet for a moment. Then Aaliyah's voice came through, soft but strong. They've been waiting their whole lives to hear your voice. And I've been waiting my whole life to be their father, Edward replied. Aaliyah, I know I have so much to prove to you. I know trust has to be earned back slowly. But I meant every word I said on that interview. I know you did, she said quietly. That's why we're ready to try. Slowly, carefully, but we're ready. The studio door opened, and Edward looked up to see Sarah walking toward him, her expression a mixture of admiration and concern. That was either the bravest thing I've ever seen or the most career-ending, she said, settling into the chair Maria had vacated. Both probably, Edward replied, but his smile was radiant. Sarah, I need you to do something for me. Anything. Start liquidating my remaining assets. I want to set up trust funds for the boys, and I want to establish a foundation for families affected by parental mental health issues. Edward's voice grew stronger with each word. And I want to buy a house. Nothing ostentatious, just a normal house in a good school district where I can learn how to be a father. Sarah studied his face. And Sullivan? The company? Are you really going to let him win? Edward considered the question seriously. 24 hours ago, losing Blackman Industries had felt like the end of the world. Now it felt like the beginning of his real life. Benjamin Sullivan wanted to destroy my legacy, Edward said finally. But my legacy was never going to be a corporation. It's going to be two little boys who grow up knowing their father chose them over everything else. His phone buzzed with a text from Aaliyah. *, the boys want to know if you like pancakes. Sunday breakfast, if you're ready, *. Edward typed back quickly. *, I love pancakes. And I'm ready, *. What would you be willing to give up to have a real relationship with the people you love most? Do you think second chances can truly heal old wounds? As Edward left the studio that night, he realized that losing everything had finally taught him what truly mattered. Success wasn't measured in market shares or board meetings. It was measured in bedtime stories, scraped knees, and the trust in a child's eyes when they called you daddy. For the first time in his adult life, Edward Blackman was about to discover what real wealth looked like. 6 months later, the Saturday morning sun streamed through the Kit Walter windows of Edward's modest 3-bedroom house in suburban Denver as the sound of small feet thundered down the stairs. He looked up from the pancake batter he was whisking, his heart still catching every time he heard his sons' voices filling his home. "Daddy! Daddy!" Benjamin burst into the Kit Walter first, his hair sticking up at impossible angles. "Ethan says you can't make pancakes shaped like dinosaurs, but I told him you're the best pancake maker in the whole world." "The whole world," Ethan agreed solemnly, appearing in the doorway in matching pajamas, clutching a stuffed elephant Edward had bought him during their first official visit. "Better than IHOP." Edward grinned, setting down the whisk to scoop both boys into a bear hug. "Well, I don't know about the whole world, but I can definitely manage some dinosaur pancakes." "What kind do you want?" "T-Rex," they chorused together, and Edward marveled again at how perfectly in sync they were, two halves of the same miraculous whole. "T-Rex pancakes coming up," Edward said, reaching for the special squeeze bottle he'd bought specifically for elaborate pancake art. "But first, go wake up Mama. Tell her breakfast is almost ready." The boys raced off with the enthusiasm only 5-year-olds possessed, leaving Edward alone with his thoughts and the familiar contentment that had become his new normal. Through the window, he could see the swing set he'd installed last month, and the garden where Aaliyah had started teaching the boys to grow vegetables. It was nothing like the sprawling penthouse or the corporate power lunches, but it was everything he'd never known he wanted. "They're getting so big." Aaliyah's voice came from behind him, soft with sleep and affection. Edward turned to find her in the doorway, wearing one of his old Columbia t-shirts and shorts, her hair pulled back in a messy bun. She was more beautiful than ever, not the polished elegance of their marriage years, but something deeper and more authentic. The woman who had raised his children alone and still found room in her heart to give him a second chance. "Good morning, beautiful," Edward said, crossing to kiss her forehead. A gentle intimacy they'd slowly rebuilt over months of careful courtship and family dinners. They were taking things slow, rebuilding trust one day at a time, but Edward had never been more certain of anything in his life. "The boys want to go to the zoo today," Aaliyah said, accepting the cup of coffee he handed her. Benjamin specifically wants to see the elephants because Ethan's been teaching him elephant facts from that nature documentary you watched together. Edward's chest warmed. These simple family moments, learning about his son's interests, discovering that Benjamin was fascinated by animals while Ethan loved anything mechanical, were treasures he'd never expected to have. "Did you see the article?" Aaliyah asked, nodding toward his tablet on the counter. Edward glanced at the device, where a business magazine article was pulled up. From Billionaire to Dad, Edward Blackman's Radical Life Change Inspires Mental Health Initiative. The piece detailed how the Edward Blackman Foundation had already helped over 200 families dealing with parental mental health crises, providing therapy resources, childcare support, and financial assistance. "Sullivan's not going to like that," Edward said, though he felt no satisfaction in his former rival's struggles. Benjamin Sullivan's leadership of Blackman Industries had been marked by scandal and declining profits. The board was reportedly considering a change, but Edward found he genuinely didn't care about corporate drama anymore. "Do you miss it?" Aaliyah asked quietly. "The power, the influence." Edward considered the question while flipping perfectly shaped dinosaur pancakes. 6 months ago, the idea of giving up his empire would have seemed impossible. Now, looking at his simple kit Walter filled with children's artwork and family photos, he couldn't imagine wanting anything else. "I miss the feeling of building something meaningful," he admitted. "But the foundation gives me that now. And this," he gestured around the warm, lived-in kit Walter, "this is the most important thing I've ever built." "Daddy!" Benjamin appeared again, breathless with excitement. "There's a man at the door with cameras." Edward and Aaliyah exchanged a look. They'd been mostly left alone by the media after Edward's follow-up interviews had painted a clear picture of a man choosing family over fortune. But occasionally reporters still tried to get candid shots of their normal life. "I'll handle it," Edward said, but Aaliyah caught his arm. "We'll handle it," she corrected gently. Together, they walked to the front door hand in hand, the boys trailing behind with curiosity rather than fear, a testament to how safe and secure their new life had made them feel. Through the peephole, Edward saw a familiar face. "It's David Walter," he told Aaliyah, referring to Sarah's brother, who worked for the local news station. "He's one of the good ones." Edward opened the door to find David with a small camera crew, but his expression was apologetic rather than aggressive. "Edward, I'm sorry to bother you at home, but there's been a development you should know about immediately." "What kind of development?" David held out his tablet, where a breaking news story was displayed. "Benjamin Sullivan arrested on fraud charges. Blackman Industries board calls emergency meeting." Edward's eyebrows rose, but he felt oddly detached from the news. "What does this have to do with me?" "The board is requesting your return as CEO," David explained. "They're saying the hostile takeover was based on fraudulent financial information Sullivan provided. They want to offer you full reinstatement with complete control." Edward felt Aaliyah's hand tighten in his, but when he looked at her, she was studying his face with calm curiosity rather than fear. "What did you tell them?" she asked. Edward hadn't told her about the call from the board's chairman that had come the night before, or the formal offer that had arrived by courier that morning. He'd planned to discuss it with her after breakfast, after they'd had their normal family morning. "I told them I'd need to discuss it with my family," Edward said, his eyes never leaving Aaliyah's face. "And," she prompted gently. Edward looked down at Benjamin and Ethan. who were listening with the serious attention children gave to grown-up conversations they didn't fully understand, but knew were important. "What do you think, boys?" Edward asked, crouching down to their level. "Should Daddy go back to his old job in the big building?" Benjamin tilted his head thoughtfully. "Would you still make us pancakes on Saturday? And read us stories at bedtime?" Ethan added, "And take us to see the elephants." Benjamin continued. Edward's throat tightened with emotion. "Every Saturday, every bedtime, every time you want to see elephants." "Then it doesn't matter where you work," Ethan said with 5-year-old wisdom. "As long as you come home to us." Edward looked up at Aaliyah, seeing his own decision reflected in her proud smile. "David," Edward said, standing up and putting his arms around his family, "you can tell the board that Edward Blackman is exactly where he belongs. If they want to offer me a consulting position that doesn't require relocating or more than 30 hours a week, I'm willing to discuss it. But my days of choosing corporate success over family are over." David smiled, clearly having expected this answer. "And the foundation will continue to be my primary focus," Edward said firmly, "along with learning everything I can about dinosaurs, elephants, and making the perfect Saturday morning pancake." As the news crew left and the family returned to the Kit Walter, Edward caught Aaliyah's hand and spun her around the way he had in their garden years ago. She laughed, the same joyous sound from their wedding photo, and Edward realized that some dreams don't die. They just wait for you to become worthy of them. "I love you," he whispered against her hair as the boys cheered and demanded their dinosaur pancakes. "I love you too," she whispered back. "All of you. The man you were, the man you became, and the father you're still becoming every day." Outside, the Colorado sun painted their modest house in golden light, and Edward Blackman, former billionaire, recovering addict, devoted father, and the luckiest man alive, flipped T-Rex-shaped pancakes while his sons told him elephant facts and his beautiful wife planned their day at the zoo. Dear viewers, what would you be willing to sacrifice to have a love that accepts all of your flaws and celebrates your growth? Do you believe that the best treasures in life are the ones that can't be bought? He'd once thought his legacy would be measured in quarterly reports and market dominance. Now he knew better. His legacy would be measured in bedtime stories, family traditions, and 2 little boys who would grow up knowing their father had chosen love over everything else that the world said mattered. And that, Edward realized as Benjamin and Ethan argued over which dinosaur was the coolest, was the most successful business venture he'd ever undertaken. Thank you for watching this story to the end. If you enjoyed this story, you will surely love the next one. It is as interesting and even more intriguing than you can ever imagine. So do check it out. Click on the image showing on your screen right now to watch the next one.